Alright guys, welcome back to another video, and today we're going to do a video on the Switch 2, but specifically against the Steam Deck, and even more specifically, the Steam Deck OLED edition, which is the one I have right here. This is the 512GB OLED edition that came out. I'm really excited to compare these and tell you guys, where my head at is with these two systems, because obviously they're both portable systems, but to me, they both offer a very different solution to very different problems. And there's a lot of things I want to talk about comparing both of these, so you guys can make a decision if you guys are thinking on which one to get, even though in my opinion they serve different purposes. In my household, maybe you only want one for yours, maybe you can only afford one and you're trying to decide between which one you should get. So we're going to talk about all the pros and cons for both of these systems, and I'm going to tell you guys why and when I choose to buy games for different systems. As somebody who owns both of these, maybe there's some people out there who are just like me, who say, hey, where should I buy Street Fighter 6? Or where should I buy this game that just came out? Should I buy it for the Steam Deck or should I buy it for the Switch? And that's the stuff we're going to get into here today. So let's go ahead and get into the video.
Gaming tech, eating brekkie is the gaming tech. Going for a brekkie is the gaming tech. Gaming techie is the gaming tech. Gaming techie.
Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to be talking about here is price. So let's start off with the Nintendo Switch 2 here on price. So this is $449 US here, and obviously the price is something that a lot of people have been talking about, that the price is too high, because of course the original Switch didn't come out for that high. I believe the original Switch released for $299, so we're talking about a pretty significant jump, but that was also 8 years ago, and things have changed in the economy, as a lot of us know, on everything being more expensive nowadays. So $449 for what you're getting, I think for me, kind of makes sense. I mean, I was hoping for $399. I think that would have been the sweet spot. At least we did get more memory now. This is 256 gigabytes as opposed to before, where we only got 32 gigabytes, which was even small back then. Even though 256 isn't that big anymore either nowadays, because I can fill this thing up really easily. You got games that are going 60, 70 gigabytes now with the new power of the Switch 2. So that's not going to last you long either. But hey, it's a 4 or 5x better ratio than what we had before on the Switch 1. Now on the Steam Deck, there is a variety of different ways that you can look at the price, because you can get the regular LCD version for $399, you can get the OLED edition for $549, or you can pay a little bit more, I believe $649, to get the 1TB OLED edition as well. Like I said, this is the 512GB one, the OLED edition right here in front of me. And, you could decide which one is for you. I wouldn't recommend anything but the OLED. I would tell you to decide between the 512 or the 1TB, and wouldn't even consider the LCD, considering how much better the OLED is. And we'll talk about more of that in a minute when we start talking about the panels on both of these systems. But that's the price difference on both. You could get a cheaper Steam Deck, but in my opinion, that Steam Deck LCD that's at $399, the Switch 2's LCD that's in there is exponentially better than what that one is. So I wouldn't even consider that as part of this equation. I'm more about comparing the OLED edition, which is $549, versus the Switch 2, which is $449. Now, speaking of the actual screens here, that's the next category we're going to be talking about. We're going to start off with the Steam Deck. So, of course, this is an OLED edition, like I talked about. The LCD version that you can get for $399 on the Steam Deck, like I said, is not something I would consider getting at all, because it's just not a very good LCD screen. It doesn't support 120 frames per second. It doesn't support VRR. It doesn't support HDR, none of that stuff. So I would tell you that you should definitely, if you're going to get a Steam Deck, to get one of the two HDR versions. And the HDR on here, of course, is a 720p screen. Again, it goes up to 90 hertz on the OLED screen, and of course the colors and stuff are fantastic on this screen because of the fact that it's an OLED. So you're going to get those inky blacks and the great contrast that you would expect from an OLED, and it makes playing games, especially colorful games, look fantastic on the screen. Now, when it comes to the Switch 2 here, as you guys are looking at, this is an LCD screen, so you're not getting an OLED. Yes, we had an OLED before on the Switch 1, and they went back a little bit, but this LCD screen is a very, very good LCD screen. When you're looking at it, it is nowhere near close as far as the original Switches that had LCDs. Those LCDs were terrible. These are much better than that, but it is not as good as the Switch 1 OLED, and it is definitely not as good as the OLED edition of the Steam Deck when you're talking about the contrast ratio on both screens, the color reproduction, and the inky blacks that you get on a dark screen. But that's to be expected, because an LCD can't be a replacement of an OLED. However, I will say that it is very hard to make a choice on which one I'd rather play my games on. When I play on this OLED, there's no doubt that it looks much better as far as the color reproduction and stuff. But when I turn on my Switch and I see that 1080p resolution, of which the Steam Deck is only 720p, and you're getting these games to have that higher increased resolution, and you're getting things to look a little bit crisper and stuff like that, and sharper, the 1080p goes a long way. And then on top of that, they can go up to 120 frames per second, where the Steam Deck only goes up to 90. On top of that, this also has VRR, variable refresh rate, which the Steam Deck does not have. And, you know, it's very hard to make that choice. Obviously, you do have HDR on these displays as well, but it is very, very hard to make a choice sometimes. Obviously, the perfect solution would be give me everything that the screen on the Switch is doing, with, you know, it being larger, which is another point that I like, is that the Switch is obviously a larger screen at 7.9 inches, where the Steam Deck is only a 7.4 on the OLED edition, up from a little bit from their original as well. So, but it is noticeably bigger when you put them side by side and you're playing back and forth like I do. You could definitely notice a bigger screen. So like I said, the perfect solution for me would be to get the Steam Deck to get everything that the Switch has, but just have the OLED panel of the Steam Deck. So give me the exact same specs as the Nintendo Switch has, the VRR, 1080p screen, you know, HDR support, and the bigger size, and give me an OLED screen. But obviously they didn't do that, because sourcing a panel of this size would probably be very expensive, because there's no other handheld out there with a 7.9 inch screen that has these specs, so they'd have to source that out themselves, and they probably also want to sell you one of the OLEDs 3 years from now. So obviously that's going to be what happens. But I will say, I'm not looking at the Nintendo Switch screen as bad as I was the original Switch screen, where it was just not great at all. This is just noticeably not as good as an OLED like you would expect, but it is still noticeably much better than a lot of the handhelds out there that use LCD screens, including the original Steam Deck that uses the LCD, because of all those features, and because the colors still pop very good on this screen. They just don't pop as good as an HDR display, or sorry, they just don't pop as good as you would expect them to pop on an OLED screen. But I still think the screen overall looks really good on the Switch. And it is a very close which one I want, depending on which, like I said, those specs that you're actually looking for. But there's no doubt that the OLED screen, when you're playing a game, looks better when it comes to colors and the black levels. But you're going to get better resolution, better VRR support on the Nintendo Switch, and that higher resolution. The next thing I want to talk about here is the ergonomics of holding this thing in your hand. So you can see here, when I hold the Nintendo Switch in my hand, it does feel really good in my hands. It feels very comfortable to hold. Obviously, you can tell that these systems are very different from each other. One is much thicker than the other, and the Nintendo Switch is obviously much thinner, where the Steam Deck is a bigger form factor. And I do have to say that I do like the form factor of the Steam Deck. I think my hands being larger fit in that very easily, and it's just a very comfortable system to hold. So even though the Switch has gotten a lot better than the original Switch did, because the Joy-Cons were so small and not that fun to use, and my hands cramped up a lot, so I had to end up getting like one of those like you know, things that a lot of people put on their Switch to make the form factor better. I don't think I'm going to have to do that on the Switch 2. I think this has gotten a lot better than where the Switch 1 was. I still overall would prefer the Steam Deck if I had a choice as far as ergonomics go, because of the fact that it just feels better in my hands, and it feels beefier in your hands. Even though it is thicker, I do like the feel of the Steam Deck in my hands than this one. But you know, they're both comfortable at the end of the day. I'm not uncomfortable with either of them, but if you're asking me which ergonomics I prefer the Steam Decks. The next thing I want to talk about here is controllers. Now, of course, on the Steam Deck here, you don't have any controllers. Everything is built into the unit, so everything is just right there for you. Now, one of the obviously core mechanics of the Switch is the fact that you can just take a Nintendo Switch and just pull the Joy-Cons right apart from the system, just like this, and you can hand this to a friend, and you can be playing Mario Kart and prop this up really easily with just the Joy-Cons. And these Joy-Cons have gotten exponentially better than the original Switch did. They're larger, the buttons are bigger, they feel better, and just easier and better to play with. They have better haptics inside of them. So the controller support, I will definitely take the Switch 2 version over the Steam Deck, because it gives you that much more flexibility. You can hand this to a friend. You always have two controllers with you, no matter where you go to play Mario Kart or Mario Party or whatever the case may be, whatever game you're playing. Or on the Steam Deck, obviously, it's much more of a solo device. And we'll talk more about later in this video. Now, as far as raw power goes, the Switch 2 is more powerful than the Steam Deck, and as more and more videos come out, that is obviously proven more and more. Now, you got to remember that when you're using these two devices together and you're playing a game just on handheld, I think the Switch is still edging it out a little bit. I played like Street Fighter 6, for example. I did a video on it on both of these, and obviously this being on a 1080p screen on the Switch, it's going to look a little bit sharper and have a little bit more details on it than the Steam Deck, but you're going to have to put them side by side to basically notice that and realize that that's actually what's going on. However, when you take the Switch 2 and you dock it into the docking, it gets a much bigger boost than the Switch 1 used to do when you put it in the dock. So when you put it in the dock, for example, Street Fighter goes from running at 1080p 60 frames per second to now running at 1440p upscaled to 4K. None of that stuff exists on the Steam Deck here because this is just a handheld device. Even if you buy a dock for the Steam Deck, it's still running at the base 800p resolution that's intended for, so the power is not going any higher because of the dock, unlike the Switch where it is getting better performance on the dock. The only thing that the Steam Deck is doing is letting you use a dock to connect it to a screen, and you could of course force the resolution to be higher of whatever monitor you have it connected to, but the power is not getting any better than what it was in handheld mode. So things like Harry Potter, for example, are running at 1440p on the Switch and have way more graphical details, not just a resolution bump, but the detail is exponentially better than what the Steam Deck has. So if you're a person who plays on dock more than you do in handheld mode, then you're going to get way better performance out of games on the Nintendo Switch than you will on the Steam Deck here. There's no doubt about that. When it comes to handheld performance, especially when you talk about the screens and the OLEDs and stuff like that, it's a little bit more of a back and forth, like, hey, what am I in the mood for? What do I want to do? How much better does this game actually look? And you'll have to look for those details, but when you put them up on the screen, there's no contest that most of the games coming out right now, like Street Fighter 6, like Harry Potter, are looking a lot better docked on the Nintendo Switch because of the power boost it gets when it is docked than you'll ever get with a Steam Deck that is plugged in to the same exact setup, even buying a dock separately. Now, when it comes to battery life here on the Steam Deck's battery life has always been really, really good, especially when you're playing indies. But when you play third-party heavy games like Street Fighter 6 and stuff like that, you usually get somewhere around the 2-hour mark-ish when you're playing heavy demanding AAA games. The Switch gets anywhere from I got like 2 hours and 20 minutes on Mario Kart, about 2 hours and like 30 minutes when I played Street Fighter. Some of the other games I've gotten 3 hours. It varies from game to game. You can get anywhere from 2 hours and a half to 7 hours on the Switch, where the Steam Deck is kind of similar, where you can get up to 9 hours depending on the game and what you can do. But of course, the Steam Deck gives you the flexibility of messing with the TP and the power levels and stuff like that. You can lower the resolution, you can lower the frame rate to get better battery life if you're on a plane. So you'll get a lot more flexibility of making this battery last even longer than you expect it to because of all that flexibility that the Steam Deck gives you, where the Switch, you just run it the way the game was intended and that's it. You're not messing around with a lot of those settings. You're really just adjusting the screen brightness to get more battery life, and that's pretty much it. But I would say on the base, without touching anything, if you just want to play games at full power, full graphics, and you want to play it on the go, I would say the Switch gets a little bit better battery performance when it comes to AAA gaming, and the Steam Deck is going to get better battery performance because of all those TP profiles that it has and everything with indies and stuff that are going to make this last a lot longer, than the AAA titles. But like I said, it goes back and forth. Some of the games will get a lot longer battery life on the Switch for me, and some of the indie stuff will get a lot better battery life on the Steam Deck. So especially with the OLED panel that, save some battery life with not having to turn all the pixels on because of the black levels and what OLED panels do. So it is a little bit of a toss-up, but like I said, the Switch edges it out a little bit in AAA games when it comes to the battery lasting about 20 to 30 more minutes than what I see on my Steam Deck. Now, when it comes to storage on this, like I said, this has a 512 gigabyte internal storage, and it does have SD support. The Switch has 256 gigabytes and also supports SD cards, but it supports micro SD express cards only. Now, the Steam Deck has no ability to use these express cards because of the internals and stuff. You're going to only be able to use regular SD cards, so you're going to get a lot better performance. Even though a lot of us are annoyed that we have to buy new SD cards, games are going to load a lot faster from the SD card on the Switch than they're going to load on the Steam Deck, and there's nothing you could do about that at that point without just getting a whole new Steam Deck when they update it. So the Switch is definitely going to edge it out in those cases when it comes to using the speeds of the SD card, but the Steam Deck will edge it out when it comes to internal storage because on this is using an SSD, unlike what the Switch is using, which is going to perform a little bit slower. It's not anything drastic, something that again you'll have to do a side-by-side for. From the games that I tested, for example, Street Fighter seems to load 1 second faster on my SD on my internal SSD on the Steam Deck as opposed to the internal storage of the 256 on the Switch. Literally a second. We're literally talking about a second or two. So nothing that crazy for you to worry about it, but I will say the micro SD card is going to be a big difference, and games are going to load a lot faster off of that than they will load off the micro SD on the Steam Deck because of the fact that Switch is making us buy those express cards. So there is the benefit of buying those new express cards, going to make their games load a lot faster, and developers can count on that being faster so they can make things like Mario Kart World where the game is open world and you can go back and forth because they know that support is there and they know everyone is on the same thing, kind of like they did on the PlayStation 5 and the Series X, where everybody knew the kind of hard drives everybody had, so developers can count on that. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is a pretty big deal for me, and that is the social and multiplayer aspect, and that's where the Nintendo Switch here shines. Like I talked about with these controllers, and there's nothing better than pulling out these controllers and handing it to a friend, no matter where you are in an airplane, at home, on a train, whatever, and you can easily play Mario Kart or Mario Party right there, prop it up with the kickstand that's on the back of it, and you're sitting it there in front of you, and your friends are playing a bunch of different games, not to mention the Switch features like local wireless, where you can play wirelessly with no internet connection wherever you kind of are if you both own the same games. Now there's even game share on it, so you can share the games and play the game even if only one person owns the copy of it. So the social aspect and the local multiplayer aspect of this is way better. On top of the fact that, of course, you can dock this on a dock very easily and then start playing with up to 8 people on the Switch, and everyone has a Joy-Con and controllers and stuff to be able to play all these different games. Local multiplayer games has always been what shines on the Nintendo Switch originally, and it is no different on here except the fact that now the Joy-Cons are even better than they were before. Obviously, on the Steam Deck, can I plug this into a dock and buy one separately? Sure. Can I then wirelessly connect Bluetooth controllers? Absolutely. But is that way more fiddly? Yes. Is that something I can do on a train ride? No. So the Switch is always going to win when it comes to local multiplayer, when it comes to sociability with your friends. And that's why it's always going to be that for me. The Switch is always going to be a system that I bring out with friends when people are over, and the Steam Deck is much more of a personal device. The next thing to talk about here too is the speakers. The speakers on both of these, there's not much to say. I think the Switch is a little bit better, a little bit clearer than the Steam Deck, but they're both very close to each other. Like I said, the Nintendo Switch holds a little bit better speaker, nothing insane, but a little bit better, and the Steam Deck is right there behind it. They both sound good enough for portability, and you can both plug in Bluetooth headphones if you don't think they're good enough either way. The next thing, of course, we got to talk about is the game library. That's a big deal when you're picking one of these consoles, and of course, the whole purpose of the Steam Deck is that it goes with your Steam library. So when you're on the PC and you're playing all of these different games, on the PC, you can easily just buy that game once on your PC. I can play it behind me, and then I can take those same games on the go, and I don't have to rebuy those games over and over again. However, this is running Linux, so not every game is going to be compatible because of, anti-cheat systems and stuff like that. You'll have to find workarounds. You'll have to dig into the operating system. You'll have to install Windows on it if you want to, and then you'll be able to get those games to play. So a lot more fiddling will have to happen if you want to go that far into it. But for the games that work naturally on the Steam Deck, it's obviously awesome that I have access to my whole entire Steam library, or most of it at least, and be able to only pay for those games once. And we know that games on the Steam Deck will go on sale way more frequently than they will ever on the Nintendo Switch platform. However, when it comes to the Switch, of course, you get the ability of using the game library that's specifically tailored to the Switch. They get a lot of exclusives from Nintendo that you're not going to be able to play elsewhere. Again, going back to the sociability and being able to play with your friends locally and stuff like that. Those are games you're not going to be able to play on the Steam Deck. And that's what makes the Switch, just like it did on the Switch 1. If I want to play the new Splatoon 3 right now, I'm not playing that anywhere else online because you're not going to be able, even if you go down the road of emulation, sure, but you can't play online. And some of these games, that's kind of the whole point. Even if the Steam Deck can today play Mario Kart World because it was hacked that quickly, you're not going to be able to play online. So what good is that going to do for me? It's not going to be anywhere near as fun. So the Nintendo Switch is always going to have that edge where you can play all the Nintendo exclusives or any exclusives that come from any other platforms, like, for example, Fast Fusion that came out and all that kinds of stuff. And the Switch gets a lot of cool local multiplayer games that come on the Switch platform. So the game library, it just depends on what you want to do and where you own it. If you only have a PC and that's your main gaming platform, then the Steam Deck might make more sense for you because obviously your games are already there. But if you really care about the Nintendo exclusives like I do and all those IPs, and then obviously you're going to need a Nintendo Switch. And that brings me to how I choose where and what I buy my games with. Obviously, as somebody who owns a PC but also owns a Switch, how do I decide where I buy my games? Well, I'm basically doing the same thing that I did on the Switch 1. I basically look at the game and I'm like, hey, is this a game that I want to play on my OLED, on my PC, on full 4K graphics? I'll buy it on the PC, and then by nature, I have that game more than likely on the Steam Deck as long as it's compatible with Linux, and I can play it anywhere I go. If it doesn't work with Linux and it's anti-cheat system and stuff like that, and I really, really love the game and it's a single player game, I'll probably still buy it on the PC, but if it's a multiplayer focused game, I might buy it on the Switch. Obviously, any exclusives, obviously I buy them on their retrospective platform, whether it be PC or on the Nintendo Switch. When it comes to anything local multiplayer, I will always choose the Switch because it's just easier to play that stuff with the Joy-Cons, whether it be on TV or on the go at a friend's house and stuff. So I will always pick it up on there. And now, if I'm just picking a game that's just for portability's sake, before I would always choose the Steam Deck because it was much more powerful than the Switch 1, but now roles have been reversed. And like I said, now you got the power of it being better in handheld with a 1080p screen on the Switch, and then on top of the fact that when it's docked it looks even better, then I will also pick those games on the Switch. So there's a lot more variability on how I pick my games. That's why it really just depends on what I plan on doing with those games. If it's a single player game that I just want to see with these beautiful AAA 4K graphics, more than likely I'm going to buy it on my PC and I'll have it on my Steam Deck if it works. If it's a multiplayer focused game, whether it be online or local multiplayer or exclusives, a lot of those times I'm going to end up picking the Switch, especially now more than ever because the Switch is more powerful than the Steam Deck. So it's going to vary case by case, which I'm sure is what a lot of people are thinking out there today too. But coming into my final thoughts here, that is everything I wanted to talk to you guys about. So let me give you guys my final wrap up. So do I recommend the Nintendo Switch 2? Of course, I love my Nintendo Switch 2. I don't regret buying it. It has exclusive games already that I've been playing nonstop on it, like Mario Kart World, like Splatoon 3, the update that came out today. Super Mario Party Jamboree is coming out with an update in July. The Pokemon games, the Zelda games that got updated and stuff that all run much better and look better with better detail, all that kinds of stuff. But I also love my companion to my PC. That's kind of what I look at this. This is my companion to my PC, where any game I buy on PC, I know I probably can play as long as there's no anti-cheat systems on the OLED screen here. And yes, the graphics are going to have to be toned down, but that's okay when you're dealing with portability and you're taking it to a friend's house or taking it on an airplane or taking it on vacation and stuff like that. But I will say, just like it always was in the Switch 1, this is my local multiplayer and party machine when friends are over. But even more so now is that I will be picking more games on the Nintendo Switch if I want to play them, and I have some, and if I want to play those in portability form sometimes, then I'll be picking them on the Switch more often than I did before because now the Steam Deck is not as powerful as the Switch here, and this has a bigger screen, which I obviously love the bigger screen and the form factor of it. So the Steam Deck is kind of going to rely on me never picking a game for it specifically for the Steam Deck. It's more about, do I want to play this game on PC? And is it only going to be a single player experience? And it just so happens that it's on my Steam Deck as well. Or is it going to be a game that I'm going to be playing online with friends or local multiplayer, and does it look great? Does it have exclusive features on the Switch that make it stand out? Some of these games, you know, have local wireless and have game shareability and have camera functionality with the camera that they've announced with game chat and stuff like that. All of those things are now going to come into play when I decide on what game I'm going to buy. Are my friends buying it on the Switch? All those kinds of things. So it's definitely going to be much more of a Switch heavy driven process now because of how much more powerful it is in dock mode and handheld mode than the actual Steam Deck is. But they're both going to get used. They're both going to have their purpose around here. I'll be carrying both to vacations when I go, and depending on what game I have and where that game is in my library, I'll be picking that one. If it's a Switch game, I'll be playing on the Switch. If I'm playing with someone next to me on a plane, of course I'll pick up the Switch. If it's a single player adventure that I already have on my PC, then I'll be picking up the Steam Deck. So it really just depends on what is going on and which one you want. But overall, my thoughts are, if you only have a PC and that's your main gaming platform, then obviously the Steam Deck is something you should be looking at because you're not going to have to buy these games twice. And if you're a really big Nintendo fan like I am and you love their exclusives, you love Nintendo games, you love specifically local multiplayer games, and stay tuned on this channel and subscribe because you guys know I make a ton of top 10 lists and top 20 lists of local multiplayer games on the Switch originally, and I'll be doing it again on the Switch 2. Then obviously the Switch 2 is for you if you like exclusives and local multiplayer. So that's my thoughts on both of these platforms, guys. Hopefully it makes you have a better idea of both of them and helps you make a decision. If you guys have any questions about anything you guys have seen, as always, leave it down below. If not, thank you guys for watching. Till next time.